do women love more than our families and our children? Money. But for centuries, women were told through culture, tradition, and even laws that money was a man's world. Thank God it's a new day. And women now are the primary breadwinners in over 40% of all households. We have higher credit scores, we save more money than men, and more women are becoming millionaires than ever before. But despite our financial prowess, women still get paid less than men. And by the account of some experts, women have a complicated relationship with money. It's the first day of Women's History Month, and from making it to embracing its power, we are talking to successful women and experts about money. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
Here for our leadoff panel is Cheryl McKissick Daniel. She is the president and CEO of McKissick & McKissick, the oldest minority and women-owned construction firm in the country. A standout in a male-dominated business, Cheryl has secured 8 and even 9-figure construction contracts for her firm. I would say this powerhouse woman knows a lot about making money. Good morning and welcome to the show, Cheryl.
Good morning. How are you today?
I am fantastic. You know, you and I met a couple of years ago. We were both at a conference, I believe it was in Florida. We were talking about women and business owners and entrepreneurship, and your story of how you trace your entrepreneurship and your current firm back to your ancestors, even going back as far as slavery, resonated with me then. And when I was thinking about this subject matter today, I said, I've got to find Cheryl McKissick. So I've been on a mission to find you because I wanted you to share this powerful, incredible story with my viewers. So tell us, Cheryl, tell us how you got started in this male-dominated business.
Well, it's a lot of history here. Let me start with that. So McKissick & McKissick is the nation's oldest Black-owned design and construction firm. We were incorporated in 1905, if you can believe that. But our origin really goes back to the first descendant of our family, Moses McKissick I, who was a slave, who was taught the trade of making bricks. And he made so many bricks, he was able to give them away and build what's called the Cheers Mansion in Nashville, Tennessee. And it was his son, Moses McKissick II, who was a master carpenter and known for his spiral staircases and gingerbread finishes on homes. But then it was Moses McKissick III and Calvin McKissick who went to school, architecture school, through correspondence and received the first license ever given to Black men for architecture. And that's license 117 and 118 in the state of Tennessee. And they also incorporated us in 1905. Obviously, these men were pioneers. But if you can imagine having a business in the Southeast, in the deep South, wow, where, you know, racism, Ku Klux Klan, everything you could think, Jim Crow, everything. Wow. And they would travel from one project to the next. And they would have to travel by day and they couldn't stay in hotels. So they had to stay with family and friends all through Alabama, Mississippi. It was just an incredible story. And then the company was passed down to my father, William McKissick, who then passed the company to my mother when he became ill. And then I took over the company. So it's an amazing story. There's a picture of us. I love it.
Wow. So your grandfather passes it down to your father brings in your mother, and then your mother brings in you.
Right.
Wow.
Yes.
So did you go to school to become, are you an architect or go to design school yourself?
Yes, I'm a civil engineer,
Okay.
an HBCU a little one on Howard University.
Okay. Yeah, look, I think I've heard
A
of it.
little one.
Okay. What school in Washington, D.C.? A couple of famous people have gone there. Okay.
Yes, I went to engineering, civil engineering school there, and received a bachelor's and a master's in engineering. So, our course was always charted for us. We knew that we were going to be in this business, construction, architecture, engineering. As little girls, we walked project sites with our father. We went to the office every Saturday. We worked as interns over the summer. By the time we were 12 years old, we had traced a whole building. So 12-story building. So it was, our lives were charted.
Want to make it clear. You're talking about your twin sister because you have a twin sister, Daryl, right? Who's also in the construction and design business.
I know. And people say, who is we? Well, I'm so used to being with my twin. We were born together. So I always say we. Most of our experiences we went through together. And so, yes, I am talking about my twin sister, Daryl McKissick. I'm so proud of her and all of her accomplishments, from the Martin Luther King Memorial to the African American Museum to now the Obama Library. So she's amazing.
So to be clear, you and your sister have separate design firms, both named McKissick and McKissick.
We have separate firms. Now, my firm, we divested of design over 10 years ago, probably 16 years ago. And we are contractors, program managers, and construction managers.
Okay.
Now, Daryl's company, they are architects and program managers and construction managers. So we kind of overlap, but...
So those projects like the African American Museum, the Obama Library, are projects that are being done. Those are contracts that your sister Daryl has under her company, correct?
That's correct. And
Wow.
Daryl was the architect of record for the Martin Luther King Memorial, and she was program manager for the African American Museum.
Wow. So okay, tell us what is it like to be in a family of two powerhouse, architects, design, professionals, engineers, with some of the biggest projects in this country. And this is such a give us some sense of how male dominated the construction, engineering, architectural industry is.
Well, it's male dominated, and it's mostly white male dominated. And I mean, every boss that I had when I worked at, other companies, say they were mostly, I can't even think of a female. They were all males. When Daryl and I graduated from Howard, there were probably, 25 people in our class, and 3 or 4 of us were women. It's just not a lot of women. Nowadays, more and more women are getting into construction. And that's one of the reasons I started expanding my personal brand, to get out and, tell young women of color, construction is a huge opportunity. It's not, people think of bricks and mortar and putting on boots and going out to a construction site and getting dirty. Well, there's so much more to make that happen. And it builds wealth and independence. And so I am trying to, tell as many young people as I can that, go to architecture engineering school. We need you. We really do.
No, what a powerful message, particularly since this is the first day of Women's History Month. I want to ask you, Cheryl, though, about some of those, that wealth. You talked about the construction industry being a way to build wealth. So I know you've negotiated, huge contracts, multi-million-dollar, 8-9-figure contracts. What has been some of the experiences you've had, negotiating such large contracts, particularly as an African American woman? Have you been met with a double standard? You're
oh God,
and you're a minority, and people trying to lowball you, pay you less than what they would pay your white male counterparts.
Yes, I mean, I have been doing this for 30 years, and I can say, early on was much worse than it is today. But I mean, even now, I'm going through a situation where we were the construction manager for, a very large project here in New York. And, they're trying to squeeze us into a much smaller role. I have to say my experiences have been much better when the owners actually understand the need to diversify and get companies like ours on board. So if we take JFK Terminal 1, where the owners are Carlyle Group, Magic Johnson, and Jim Reynolds, Loop Capital out of Chicago and New York, their approach is just totally different than say some, white developer in New York. Their approach is not, let me check a box and make sure I've, socially, look through the window dressing to say I've done MWBE. No, theirs is we actually really do want to have MWBE. We want to grow capacity of, MWBE firms. They treat them with respect. Yeah, sometimes people, just because you're an MWBE, they think you're not worthy. Your product, which you're providing, your services are substandard. All these things, which is not true.
Yeah.
And you still hear that today.
You're using the acronym MWBE for folks that don't know. It's Minority and Women Business Enterprises. So that's a classification that many women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses have, and they're big firms that say they want to solely work with or give some portion of their business to MWBE firms like yours. So you're in the room, Cheryl, negotiating a 8-figure, 9-figure contract, and you get some pushback, and you believe that it's based on your gender. What do you do?
Well, I take a lot of different routes depending on who the client is and what the situation is. If I can muster political support, I do that. If I can bring a consultant in to help me negotiate, I will do that. Sometimes I'll say, listen, I think this is a microaggression. And I'll check them on that.
You call it out.
I'll check them on that. I try not to pull the race card. I try. But sometimes you just have to say it.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to say, you would not treat me like this if I were this other firm that wasn't, a Black female-owned business.
What do you think? You obviously, and you have such rich history and ancestors to, I'm sure they are responsible in some part for it, but you obviously are really comfortable, being in rooms where folks are making a lot of money and big decisions are being made. A lot of women are not comfortable embracing, the power that money has, because of culture, tradition, and even laws. As I said, the opening of the show, women have been, we've been fed a lot of lies about money, and we have this really complicated relationship with money. How did you, if you ever had any, trepidation or hesitation, how did you overcome it in terms of being comfortable, just embracing that you're a Black female and you're at the table and you're making these multi-million, maybe even billion-dollar deals?
I think that came over time, just being comfortable in who I am and what I'm bringing to the table and knowing that it brings value. In my 20s and in my 30s, yes, I felt like a fish out of water. I felt, alone, walking into large banquets or dinners or events, and it's a sea of suits and white men, basically. And it's amazing how they congregate and talk to one another. For me, I'd have to make conversation. And then, 10 years of doing that, one day I just said, I am not running up to anybody else. I am done with that. Okay. I'm going to let them come speak to me.
Yes, I love it. I love it. Last question for you, Cheryl. What advice would you give to a young woman starting out in her career, whether it's in construction or design or engineering? Women, so many mixed messages again about money. What advice would you give a young woman starting out in her career who maybe feels shy about even saying I want to make a lot of money. Just even having the confidence to say that.
Well, at first, it's a journey. Okay. It is not going to happen overnight. So you have to have a passion for whatever business that you're going into. And when you have that passion, eventually you begin to understand and know for yourself that you're worthy. That, deep inside, you have to know that you are worthy and that you are adding value to any equation when you walk in the room, whoever you talk to, and that will come across. But it's a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. I think it's important to, educate yourself to as far as you can. Whatever you are into, you need to know it 100%. And then you have to have determination and perseverance. All the things that make you wake up in the morning and meet that challenge that will come.
Well, thank you so much for those encouraging words. What better way to kick off Women's History Month than talking to a powerhouse like you? Best of luck to you and to your sister, Daryl, who I've actually met here in Los Angeles. So now I feel like I know the whole family. I got the history. So again, just so much love and continued success to the both of you, and keep lifting up your voice and definitely getting your brand out there, encouraging women that this construction business is one that we should definitely be better and have more representation in, because there's lots of money to be made, and money is power. And one thing I think women forget is we can use
Yes.
money for good. We can go and change communities. We can feed the hungry. We can end childhood poverty. There's so much we can do. And men have known it for years, and now we know it. So now we
Right.
know. So glad to, again, sit down with you this morning, Cheryl. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All
It's a
right, next I
pleasure.
want to bring on my next guest. We've talked about making money, but there's still a reality in this country that women still don't make the same amount as men do for the same jobs. And to discuss that this morning is Dr. C. Nicole Mason. She's the president and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, a prominent Washington, D.C. think tank. I think Dr. Mason is the youngest woman to head this think tank. Also joining me is Jocelyn Fryer. She is a senior fellow for the Center for American Progress. She has worked in the White House for both Obamas, Michelle and Barack, and she happens to be a classmate of mine from Harvard Law School. Good morning, ladies.
Good
And
morning.
welcome back, Jocelyn. So good to see you again. And thank you, Dr. Mason, for joining us. We heard Cheryl McKissick's story, her powerful story of not just Cheryl, but her twin sister, Daryl. So two women who are, really making headway in this male-dominated construction business, and doing so very, very successfully, working on some of the largest projects in the country. But the reality is women still make less than men in similar roles. Why, Jocelyn, are we still having this discussion about women making less money when we have powerhouses like Cheryl and Daryl who are so incredibly competent and capable?
It's a great question, Areva, and thank you for inviting me. It's a challenge because, I think, there are so many incredible women, accomplished women, and you would like to think that we could just fix all the problems and close the gap. But there are a couple of things that are going on that I think are relevant. One is that women disproportionately are working in minimum wage jobs. They're lower paid jobs. That has always been true. It continues to be true. Women are disproportionately caregivers. They do the bulk of caregiving for their families. That's something that's been highlighted over the last year during the pandemic. And as a result, they end up working fewer hours simply because they're out of the workforce more. And so they experience a penalty for basically taking on those responsibilities. The combination of that lowers their wages. And then on top of that, when people dissect the wage gap, one of the things they find is that discrimination is also a piece of that. Anywhere as much as 40% of the wage gap is due to discrimination. So, the combination of all of those factors leads to women consistently being paid less. And that's even more so for women of color, Black women, Latinas, Native women, and some Asian American women may make less than white women, and in comparison to their male counterparts. And so, it's a challenge that we continue to work on.
Yeah, Dr. Mason, Jocelyn mentions the pandemic, and we do know that there are, there's some studies out that show that women were hit harder economically by the pandemic than men. And knowing the history that Jocelyn just laid out for us, do you think this country should have done a better job? Or maybe, I won't even ask you, should they? We know the answer is yes. But what better job could we have done to prepare for this pandemic, and particularly the economic impact that it would have and it has had on women? Oh, I think you're muted, Dr. Mason.
Sorry.
Zoom. That's a really good question. And the truth of the matter is that at the beginning of the year in 2020, we were celebrating this milestone where women were 50% of the workforce. But underneath it, what we weren't discussing was the everyday struggle and the economic vulnerability of many women, women of color, low wage workers, their reality, even though they were making up a large chunk of the workforce, they weren't doing well economically. And because of things like pay inequity, discrimination, no benefits, no job security. And so when the pandemic hit, those women were hit hardest because of the economic vulnerability they were already experiencing in the labor market. And it just became exacerbated. And those women also continued to fall out of the workforce at higher rates than other groups of women. In December, more than 100,000 jobs were lost, all by women. But when you look a little bit more closely at it, it was all women of color, Black and Latino women. So, we haven't done a really good job of having a good social safety net, making sure that workers are fairly compensated and have benefits. And, during the pandemic, all of that came into focus.
Jocelyn, so when you hear this, I guess I'm sitting here thinking, and I'm sure lots of women are thinking, this has been the year of the woman, right? We've elected Kamala Harris to the vice presidency. We had more than 50 women of color go into the U.S. Congress. We saw the power of women in terms of even getting Joe Biden to become the Democratic nominee. We saw what Stacey Abrams and Latanya Brown did in Georgia to turn that state from red to blue. So when you think of all that women have done, we make up, a greater percentage of the electorate. Why can't we solve this issue? It just seems kind of ridiculous in some ways that we're still talking about this when you think of all the power that women have.
Well, you're absolutely right. But I think the challenge here is that despite everything you just said, including the tremendous power of women to really drive electoral outcomes, it has not resulted in policymakers actually translating that into concrete policies that will make a difference for women. We have things like the Paycheck Fairness Act that would improve and strengthen equal pay laws. We have paid family leave and paid sick leave. Those bills have been languishing, and we haven't seen action on them. So, I think policymakers are good at rhetoric. There are very few people who say that they're against equal pay. They all say that they're for work family policies and paid leave. And, they say all the right things, but the actions speak louder than words. And they simply haven't followed through on those policies. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to hold them accountable for that, because the action on these issues is long overdue.
Yeah, speaking of rhetoric and holding people accountable, Dr. Mason, prime example, this fight for 15. We now are passing a stimulus bill, or the House has passed it, with a $15 increase in the minimum wage for the federal minimum wage. The Senate is going to be forced, because of this parliamentarian's decision that it can't be in a reconciliation bill, to take it out. So we're not going to have a $15 increase in minimum wage, even though we know that 32 million workers would benefit from the increase. And we know that women make up the majority of low wage earners. What is going on with the folks who are governing our country that we can't get a paltry $15, which if you live in Los Angeles, you're still going to be living near poverty, even with $15 an hour?
It's really unconscionable, to be really, frank. And When Jocelyn was talking, I was thinking about the Fight for 15 or raising the minimum wage. Again, passing it would be, disproportionately help, or women of color would benefit from raising the minimum wage. At the end of the day, it's really white men who are making all of these decisions and legislating, and without regard for not even their own constituency, by the way. And so I mean, like Jocelyn said, there are really good bills, the Paycheck Fair Transparency Act, this stimulus bill. We know what needs to be done. It's the will at both the Senate and the House to get those things passed and done. And so, as Jocelyn said, our power, our political power, our electoral muscle is not necessarily in this moment translating into political and policy wins for us. And that's quite devastating. And I just hope that not only, we keep exercising our muscle, but that we change who represents us. Some of these people need to go.
Yeah. A lot of these people, let's just call it out. A lot of these people, the men in the U.S. Senate, and women, to the extent they're women, because we know they're Republican women as well, who are refusing to raise the minimum wage. It's just like you said, unconscionable, unthinkable when you think about how many folks have fallen into poverty as just a result of COVID-19. And who were in poverty even before the pandemic. Last question for you, Jocelyn. We have Kamala Harris in the White House. We know the Biden administration has said they are not going to take any efforts to overrule the decision by this parliamentarian that's forcing the $15 piece to come out of this stimulus package. What do we do?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, the call of action and call for action from advocates is that you find a way. There are all sorts of rules and all sorts of policies, and this may be one ruling, but that the task here is to not give up. It's too important. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to continue to make our voices heard on this. Raising the minimum wage is not a partisan issue outside of DC. There are red states that have raised the minimum wage. There's lots of consensus on it. And what we know is that it would help boost folks' wages and move some folks out of poverty, to be sure. So I think we just keep pressing forward. The only other thing I would say about it is that, it's a reminder of the conversation that many of us have had about structural bias, right? Like the rules of the Congress have been set up and interpreted in a way that structurally excludes opportunity for a whole range of folks, disproportionately people of color. And, I think we have to rethink whether those rules make sense if that's the outcome, and think about, are there alternative ways to make sure that good policies are being moved forward? We simply should not land on an outcome that says you can't raise wages for the people who are most in need. If that's the answer, then you need to rethink whether or not the rules you have in place are working properly.
Yeah, we've got to leave it there. But thank you so much, Jocelyn. Thank you, Dr. Mason. Absolutely, don't give up. I mean, it has to be the message. Even though we didn't win this battle today on the minimum wage, the fight isn't over. And we got to stay in the fight and stay persistent in our call to hold those elected officials accountable, including the minority leader, Mitch McConnell, and any other Republicans and Democrats, quite frankly, that refuse to recognize the dignity of the labor of men and women in this country, primarily African American and Latino, who are stuck in those low wage jobs. Again, thank you so much, Jocelyn. Good to see you again. And thank you, Dr. Mason, for all of your work.
Thank you.
All right. Before I bring on my next guest, as I said, it's Women's History Month. So we got a little women's history trivia for you. As you heard those women say, our experts say, mostly women stuck in low wage jobs. So what year was the minimum wage even established in this country? Was it 1938, 1948, or 1968? Again, what year was the minimum wage established in this country? A lot of talk about the minimum wage, raising it, not raising it. But I want to know, when did it even become a part of U.S. policy? 1938, 48, or 68? Go ahead, start posting your answers, your responses. Again, don't Google, don't look it up. I want you guys to use your brain power on this one. And a little later in the show, we're going to have a response for you. Okay, now my next guest, she is making history. She is the first African American woman to head, as its president, the National Organization for Women, better known as NOW. It's the nation's largest organization of feminist grassroots activists. Joining me is Christian Nunes. Good morning, Christian.
Good morning, Areva. How are you this morning?
I'm well. Well, thank you so much for asking. Congratulations. Being the
Thank
first
you.
is always difficult. Kamala Harris likes to say she's been the first, but she doesn't want to be the last in many positions that she has held. So I'm sure you share in that sentiment in your new role as president of NOW. But tell us, what has it been like leading this powerhouse feminist organization?
Sure. I first want to just acknowledge in 1970, we did have a Black president, Eileen Hernandez. And yes, and so she's the president for a year. And so I am the second Black president, but in 55 years.
Okay.
And so it's like
being, caveat. We Googled that, and that was information we found on the internet, which is another warning, admonition about everything you read on the internet is not accurate. We didn't make it up. We did find an article on the internet, but thank you for that correction.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I give her respect,
Absolutely. And so do I. And I regret that we found some bad information. So definitely give it up for the first Black woman. And so you're the second in 55 years.
Yes.
So something to celebrate.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially in this time, as you mentioned, it's been a historic year for Black women being elected into office, having the first Madam Vice President, Kamala Harris, as our vice president, as a woman and as a Black woman and Indian American woman. So we are super excited and I'm super excited to be taking the helm of NOW at this moment to really help push our work from an intersectional perspective.
So we're showing these old images of NOW. And the reason I want to do that is because, I think people have this vision of NOW as being these radical, and it was considered in the 60s when it was started, this radical organization of women who were trying to destroy, our institutions and systems as we knew them. And it's interesting because when you think of now the feminist organization, Black women and feminists have had a very difficult history together. So how have you been able to address some of the tension that has existed historically between Black women and white feminists?
Sure. Well, I would like to say that NOW has really taken initiative probably in the early 2000s to push forward. One of our core issues is racial justice. And we really make an effort to make sure that all the work that we're doing from this point has included racial justice. And in 2019, we as an organization, and I took the spearhead of leading this project, is making sure we had a racial equity program and plan that not only we did work internally so that we can make sure that we are doing our work as an organization, challenging our issues and challenging our needs to make sure we're creating space. And I say safe space for women of color, Black women, Latina, Latinx women, Indigenous women, Asian Pacific Islander women. We want to make sure we're creating safe space, but also so that we can be anti-racist, intersectional allies, and understanding the importance of looking at how all different types of oppression affect women. It's not always just gender and race, but it's also her immigration status, her disability her disability. It has to do with her class. It has to do a lot of different things. And we have to look at that. And so since I've been on, we've been making a major effort to make sure that the work we're doing is from a racial justice perspective, an economic justice perspective, and a very much an intersectional lens that we're looking at the work.
So, Christian, I have to ask you, when I look back at NOW, again, this 60s organization had a rap as being, men-hating, bra-burning, white liberals who were taking to the streets to demand justice for women, or liberation, I would say, for women. We've made a lot of progress, no doubt. Don't want to dismiss the progress that we've made over the last 40, 50 years. But what is it we're doing wrong? Something's not working. If we're still having a discussion about women making less money than men, from the marches to the protest rallies, to the policy work that organizations like the one that Jocelyn works for is doing, where are we missing the mark? Because something is not working in our strategy.
Well, Areva, that's a great point you bring up. And I think what we keep going back to is we are not looking at how do we dismantle the underlying causes that contribute to the inequities we're seeing with gender. We're not looking at our society. United States of America is built on a white patriarchal, hierarchy in the system. So, and it's deeply ingrained. And unfortunately, we have women and men and transgender non-conforming all buying into the system because we were raised this way. We were raised to believe certain beliefs and perspectives. So we have to try to undo that learning. And we have to take the initiative to make sure that we're educating ourselves about how this has impacted us and continues to impact us on levels of oppression, gender inequality, economic injustice, racial injustice, violence against women, gender violence as well, because that's a big part also plays into gender discrimination that sometimes we leave out. So I think it's going further just in saying we need to have an equal wage. We're looking at all the ways that the whole system is preventing us from having an equal wage with the white man.
Okay, Christian, we're in this though 100 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not pushing back on you as much, but I guess I'm just frustrated. And I think many women are frustrated. Like, is this going to take another 200 years? Like, when are we going to get to pay equity in this country? I think I saw a report that says it's going to be 2070.
Yes.
As we sit here today in 2021, they're saying it's going to take us another 49 years before women catch up. Is that what your research, is that, what you're hearing? Is that what is our reality that we just have to, somehow get comfortable with?
I don't think we get comfortable at all, Areva. And I think what Jocelyn and Nicole Mason was saying earlier were really important. And that's the fact that we have to look at how our policies are going in place. And are we passing legislation that on a state level and a federal level that really truly is in favor and taking into the real narratives and experiences of women, especially women of color who are most importantly disproportionately impacted by the gender gap. So it goes beyond that. I think we have to really start holding our elected officials, the legislators, accountable and asking them to pass legislation, create legislation that has a real reflection of the needs of women so that the gender inequalities can erase. I think sometimes we look at things and—
I'm going to ask you, haven't we done that? I'm thinking back to when Carol Moseley Braun was elected, when Barbara Boxer was elected to the U.S. Senate. That was the year of the woman. Now we're back having another year of the woman, but we keep having these years of the woman, and we're still having these regressive policies that penalize women when it comes to something as simple as making the same amount for the guy you're sitting next to in the cubicle doing the same job. So is that working? I don't know. Maybe these big years where we elect more women, that doesn't seem to be moving the needle in the substantial way that we need the needle to move.
But we need to hold the male, elected officials accountable as well, because as one of the panelists clearly said, we are looking at the majority of movers and policymakers and changes that are taking place are white men, even with the election of lots of women of color. And so we need to start holding accountable those who have been in power and have been holding the power to step up and stand up for women. It can't continually be, okay, women, working hard, women is trying. We have to have men step up and challenge some of the misogyny, the toxic masculinity, some of the belief systems, the patriarchal belief systems that hold women in places in gender roles that are no longer acceptable. And those are the things that we have to do. And I think that's where we forget and we lack in the work that we're doing as advocates and activists. It's like there's a shared responsibility. It can't be all on women's organizations to be responsible for moving this and creating the education. It also is a time for men to step up and also say, you know what, I as a male employer, I as a male business owner am no longer going to have secrecy in my wages in my organization. I'm no longer going to look at a woman and think, okay, well, she's only good for this role. I'm going to help eliminate the bias within my own company. I'm going to appoint more women to boards. I'm going to appoint more women to positions of power. I'm going to take the necessary steps that I need to do to help also challenge this gender inequities on a local and state level. And then also having organizations get together and start writing policy and getting together elected officials and saying, here's clearly what our community is experiencing. Here's clearly the changes that need to happen. And this is how it looks on the real. Because I think sometimes, there's a big disconnect between policy that's written and what the real experience is for individuals. And we need to bridge those two.
I'm running out of time, but I do want to agree with you wholeheartedly. In fact, I'm writing a new book that comes out in August called Awakening, which makes the very point that you're making, which is women can't do this alone.
Absolutely.
We dismantle these systems that are controlled by men, and that we spend a whole lot of time as women and women organizations trying to dismantle these systems. And we got to spend a lot more time getting men to understand that they hold the key and we can't do it without them. They've got to be an active partner, in some cases the lead, because they do hold the power. I don't know if I'm past believing that someone like Mitch McConnell and some of these 60, 70, 80-year-old white men in our government are going to change, have the capacity to change or the willingness to change. I am more hopeful that a younger generation of white men are more, I'll use the word woke, are definitely more conscious of the role that they play in being allies to not only women-led organizations, but social justice and racial justice organizations. So I am hopeful. I don't know about holding folks like Mitch McConnell accountable, because we talk about that. He was just elected by almost a landslide in Kentucky, despite the high poverty rates in Kentucky, despite the horrible health care and all the challenges that people in Kentucky have. They just sent Mitch McConnell back to the U.S. Senate for another full term. So I don't know. We're not going to solve it in this conversation, but I do think we've got to rethink this whole strategy about how we get to equity in this country. I want to thank you, Christian, for the work you're doing it now. Obviously, you guys are giving a lot of thought to this, and you've articulated some pretty sound new ways, I think, that we should be thinking about women and money and equal pay. So again, congratulations on your role.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Okay, we've been talking about women and money. We've been talking about pay equity. Now we want to talk about this complicated relationship that women have with money, from being less likely to ask for a raise, from devaluing our own work. We've got to shift the mindset that we as women have around money. And my next guest have some suggestions on how we do that. So welcome back to the show, Stacey Tisdale. She's the creator of Mind Money Media. Also joining me this morning is Eugenie George. She is a financial wellness specialist and author of Our Money Stories. And here with us is Linda Scott. She's a professor emeritus at Oxford University and author of The Double X Economy. Good morning, ladies, and thank you for joining me this morning. We've been having this conversation about women making money like Cheryl. How do we get to, equity with the Now organization and other experts? But now I want to talk about our role, because we're not going to wait around, as we have not done, for men to solve our money issues. And we still have this kind of complicated relationship with money. Stacey, you just wrote an article, in essence, talking about women being less likely to ask for a raise than men. But then I read this other headline that said, no, women are asking for raises, but we just don't get them. So which is it, Stacey? Are we asking and not getting them, or are we not asking for raises in the same way that men are?
You're touching on so many things. Women have a very complicated relationship with money. And I saw a recent study by an organization that found that only 7% of women are confident in their ability to make financial decisions. Hold up with that, because women control the majority of the world's wealth. Women will inherit the majority of the world's wealth because they live longer than men. Women do not step into their economic power. And to answer your question, for the most part, we don't negotiate. Particularly, that has ramifications for first salary. I think you have about 7% of graduate student women's negotiating their first salary, as opposed to 50-some% of men. And not negotiating your first salary costs you $500,000 over the course of your career. But the reason that this financial conversation is so important, particularly in the context of what you've been talking about, let's step back for a minute and look at who really controls the power here. We're talking about legislators letting us down with this minimum wage disappointment. We're talking about all of the transformation that has to take place in corporate cultures. It's true that there's a lot of will out there. I cover it all the time. Corporations are, clamoring, hook me up with Black women, hook me up with Black women. Companies are throwing billions of dollars into Black female entrepreneurs. But the question has to become now who we are. They have to know who they're dealing with. So we're dealing with a movement instead of just a moment. One solution that it's just not part of the conversation. What did we just learn from GameStop? We learned that investors, when they got together collectively, I'm not saying it was done in the wisest way there because the investors weren't looking at the fundamentals, but these are publicly traded companies. The public can move the needle. George Floyd is always thought of the transitional moment. That poor man's death wasn't the moment. The protests that followed were the moment. So people are forgetting the power that they have. This whole GameStop debacle. Congress was in session, like the next day, looking at changes that they can make. As particularly women, particularly Black women, we have amassed so much buying power, so much financial power in the face of tremendous odds. We're a tremendous story of resilience. If those efforts were organized, this is where solutions can come from. The public sector hasn't done it. The private sector hasn't done it. Technology is coming in and providing solutions that could move the needle in ways that we're just not looking at and using yet.
Yeah, you've written about this, and you've said that our personal history, our ancestry, and our environment play a role in our money habits. What do you mean by that?
I call it money script. I'm sorry, I thought you were talking to me.
Yeah, I was asking you, Janae. She's written about this a lot. You both have, but you should jump in.
So Stacey was kind of talking about big picture, and I wanted to get more learning about different people's stories. So I did interview over 40 women of color and just walk through their whole story of what is their money story, what are some of the hangups. And throughout time, it didn't matter if they were making six figures or if they were making minimum wage, women, and particularly women of color, didn't understand how their history could play such a huge role in how they're even thinking about money. So for starters, one of the young ladies that I spoke to would always say that she wasn't good at math, right? And money is math. So if you're automatically having that historical idea of, oh, women aren't good at math, Miss, such and such said that I wasn't good at math, then in your mind internally, you're going to not ask for raises. So it's really simple steps. And we really do have to get clear on, okay, what were we taught about money? If you are a woman of color, you're going to have to deal with a lot more barriers. And I think right now where we're at is we're seeing a lot of folks that are doing like the hustle mode, like get those businesses, start them up. And it's like, yes, that's great. I'm glad that 64% of new owned businesses are women of color. However, we really need to look at the actual numbers, like what are we spending our money on? How are we saving? What are we doing? Are we taking care of our health? And so we can actually look back from historical policies that were put in place, and you can actually track them based on someone's ethnicity. So for example, when I interviewed a lot of Asian Americans, one of the policies that were put in place was the Chinese Exclusionary Act, which meant that no one was able to become citizens if they were identified as Asian Americans. And that didn't really, the policy that were put in place wasn't even relaxed until 1962. So when I was interviewing women that identified as Asian Americans, they were saying like, oh, I do want to make money, but I actually should never talk about it, right? If you're not talking about it, then that's going to affect how you're going to ask for money. Yeah. So it's really important to actually understand parts of your ancestry and then also the environment that you grew up in. so that you can understand your money story, so that you can ask for money and ask for a raise and start a business.
Yeah, Linda, I want to bring you into the conversation. You write about women globally. What has your research, what does your research tell you about this complicated relationship that women still have with money? Stacey said that we have the majority buying power in this country. Women do, but yet we still are having a difficult time embracing that power. Why the dichotomy?
Right. Yeah. It's an interesting thing, actually. The pattern of exclusion from money and being underpaid and all of those things that we point to in this country as evidence of women's economic disadvantage are actually common around the world. In fact, they're uniform around the world. And I was interested in this reference, for example, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, because you can trace women's disadvantages in this economy and in other economies to earlier rules and laws that didn't allow women to own land, for example, or required them to turn over any earnings they had to their husbands. And we're really not that far from those days. We think we are, but for example, there used to be a law in which American men have the right to take any assets or any earnings that their wife has. And that law was not struck down as unconstitutional until 1982. So it's more
we were looking up some other obscure things that happened to women in money, and I think it was 1960 when women were allowed to open their own bank accounts.
That's right, and they were not allowed to have their own credit, not even credit cards, until 1974. So it's really much more recent, the total exclusion, and so in a way we're sort of digging out from under that still. I think it's also really important, if I may jump in, that we stop blaming women for it, saying, well, women should do this or women should do that. Because I think for a while, since the 70s, it was a realistic thing to do. Well, what did women need to do differently? At this point, I just don't think the evidence says that. I think that that what we have are structural problems that need to be addressed as structural problems, and a great deal of bigotry still among some men. And if we're not willing to call that stuff out, we're not going to get there.
No, we definitely have to call it out. We call it out all the time on the special report. That's why I was a little perplexed by these competing arguments. One article by one expert said that women weren't asking for pay raises, and then another article said that's a myth, that women are asking, but that they're being denied. 25% of the women that ask for an increase are being denied. So I think there's this very contradictory sometimes picture of the role that women play in our quest for equality and things like equal pay. We hear that too around valuing our worth. Let's talk about that some. Women work in the home, not valued, not just by men, but even many women don't value the work that we do in the household. Have you seen any positive changes in that, Stacey, in terms of how we think about the role that women play, the caregiving, the child giving, all of things which we heard Jocelyn say are, parts of the reasons that we have this differential in pay between men and women?
I think the COVID kind of lifted the veil on this a little bit. And, women are doing 90% of the housework. And they're also, for Black women, 3 out of 4 are also their heads of household. I think what we're all touching on here is there's a financial literacy crisis in this country, and we really have to expand our definition of what financial literacy is. It's a holistic picture. Since the beginning of time, men have been conditioned to provide and protect. Women have been conditioned to nurture. So through time, they value money differently. So you touched on a beautiful point earlier, this whole, women aren't negotiating more and they need to negotiate more. It's because if you ask women what their aspirations are, they're much more goal oriented. If you ask men what their aspirations are, they're much more return oriented. That's why women tend to perform better in the stock market than men do, because they buy and hold. The key is understanding the differences, understanding that as a woman, I value money differently. So my tendency is not going to be to ask for this raise or this promotion. So I have to know that about myself going in. So it's really, taking that holistic approach as a person of color. I mean, in my research, I identified the three main drivers in our financial behavior. I call them money scripts. There's childhood scripts, the way we saw money handled or not growing up. There's social scripts, those images we get from the world of what it means to be normal. There's social scripting around gender, race. So we have to ask ourselves, what do I see people like me doing when it comes to things like saving, investing, negotiating for themselves? What do I see people like me not doing? How would I change my scripting and my messaging if I were to live out, the grandest vision that I have for myself? But it's not in a blame thing. It's much more, a lot of these answers are in science. It's much more understanding our conditioning and our science, but more important, knowing how to navigate that. So men and women value money differently. They just do, and that shouldn't be something women should feel badly about, but they have to understand how it works in the working world.
Let me ask you, Linda, is that consistent with the research that you've done?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you, Linda. Is what the point that Stacey is making about women and men valuing money differently and that causing them to behave differently, particularly in the workplace around things like raises and negotiating raises, is that consistent? Because I thought I heard you saying that wasn't consistent with the research that you've done.
Yeah, I think that where I would make the distinction would be, again, that we need to take a look at the other side of the bargaining table. That, for example, if we say, oh, well, women don't ask for a raise because they value money differently. They certainly do value money differently, but it's also the case that the research shows that, and you mentioned this before, is that when women do ask for a raise, they make the person on the other side of the table angry, and they're often punished for it. If they're just being offered the job, they won't get the job. If they have the job and they're asking for a raise, not only will they not get the raise, but the boss will be angry with them about it. And so their whole work environment will be debilitated. And so it can be true, in fact, as you said before, it can be true that women don't ask for raises, but also that when there is, in essence, women know intuitively that if they ask for a raise, they're risking this negative backlash. Mm-hmm. So they don't ask.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that, Linda. I haven't done the extensive research that you've done, but I've done some research on this, and I just know from talking to hundreds of women that they've had experiences in the workplace when they ask for a raise, they're treated very differently than when their male counterparts. There's this assumption that somehow they should just accept whatever they're given, and that, men need more money than women because, after all, they are the caregivers and they have families at home they have to take care of, and they need the promotion and they need the raise, more than the woman, and that somehow you're stepping out of your little subservient role as woman when you do speak up for yourself, whether it's for that promotion or for that raise. So in addressing this issue, yes, women, we've got to, be assertive, but we've also got to educate those men, which was the conversation I was having with Christian, to, dismantle those structures. And we need men to do that. We need the men that we're talking to. Because I can ask them, I'm blue in the face, but if I'm sitting across from some white, racist, sexist man who thinks that little old black Areva should stay in her place and how dare you ask me for money, then that's not going to go over well. And I'm probably going to be getting a pink slip the next day. Okay.
Yeah, let me clarify. When I'm saying men and women value money.
Seconds. My producer's telling me I'm out of time, but go ahead. I'll give you 30 seconds.
Yeah, men and women, when I'm saying they value money differently, returns aren't the first thing that comes to a woman's mind. When you're talking about shifting corporate cultures, and in order to do that effectively, more women have to be at those leadership positions. Because yes, they have to ask for raises less confrontationally. There's things that we have to do. But that shift means bringing more women to the core of those organizations so that there's a better understanding of what they're really going through and that they are in those leadership positions and making those decisions.
Yeah, and that's what I think this whole conversation comes down to for us as women. We're sick of having to do things to make men comfortable. We should be able to walk in and ask for a raise with the same gumption, the same aggressiveness, the same assertiveness as a white male and get the damn raise if we are entitled to the damn raise. Okay, I got to leave it there. Y'all, thank you so much. But I got to answer this question, our trivia question. Do any of you know what year the minimum wage was established in this country?
1938.
All right, Stacy, good for you. I saw the rest of the women calculating. You all probably knew it. Just took a moment to think about it. But yes, it was 1938 with the passage of the Labor Standards Act. Thank you so much, Stacy, Linda, Eugene, for joining me. What an interesting conversation. It's Women's History Month. So we're going to be talking about women and money and women and equality throughout this entire month. We should be talking about it every month, not just in March. But again, thank you so much for sitting down with me this morning. Wow, I get really excited when I have powerful women on because it energizes me and I feel empowered learning and listening to and learning from these powerful women. I want to thank all of my guests this morning, and thanks to you for joining us as we're kicking off Women's History Month. Words to live by before I get out. As long ago as 1776, Abigail Adams implored her husband, quote, "Remember the ladies," quote, while drafting the Constitution. John Adams was not easily swayed, asserting that men know better than to repeal our masculine systems. This singular statement sums up women's battle with money. When the Constitution was being drafted, domineering anti-abolitionists and in many cases slave-owning white dudes decided that women were essentially second-class citizens and that we should forever be dependent on them for our livelihood. Since that moment in history, women have been fighting for the right to be treated as equals, including the right to be paid the same as men for similar work. The Equal Pay Act signed into law by JFK made it illegal to pay men and women working in the same place different salaries for similar work. Unfortunately, though, this act did not close the wage gap due to limited enforcement and inadequate remedies. The ERA attempted to do what the Equal Pay Act failed to do. But since 1972, there has been enough opposition to the idea of granting women and men equal constitutional protections to prevent the ERA's ratification by all 50 states. Some of the ridiculous arguments in opposition to the ERA are: women would be sent into combat. Privacy rights would be overturned. It will cost businesses more money. And my favorite argument in opposition to the ERA is women would lose the right to be supported by their husbands. For the record, a husband is not and has never been a financial plan. Women are not sitting in towers waiting for men or going off to college in search of a husband. Women are representing in every industry in this country. We have economic freedom. We run multi-million-dollar, in some cases billion-dollar companies like Cheryl McKissick. And it's past time that the fruits of our labor and our contributions to the economy are recognized. And not just with some obligatory month, but with hard, cold cash. Because like best-selling author and success coach Rita Davenport said, money isn't everything, but it ranks right up there with oxygen. I'm out, y'all. Don't forget to wear your mask. Be safe out there. And remember, we're all in this together.